Hey everyone, welcome to Outside the Walls. My name is John White.
I'm Casey McDonald.
And today we are joined by Luke Dockery. Luke is the youth minister over at the Cloverdale Church of Christ and also the author of Youth in Family Ministry, a handbook, and has been in youth ministry for 15 years now. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you. Appreciate you guys having me on. Glad to be with you today.
Now, I was wondering if you were getting upset because we had Carl and Philip on the show. I was like, well, when's my turn?
Yeah, I mean, I was offended, but I wasn't going to bring it up, but you did. So.
Trust me, you were on the list. You were on the list. Oh. So, Luke, you've been a youth minister at Cloverdale. You started like just before the pandemic.
June of 19, so it's been almost 2 years. So I was here for about 6 months or so, and then the world broke. And we all had to like reinvent everything that we did. Yeah, so it was fun.
So what was that like for you to kind of only have about 6 months or so to get used to youth ministry and be in a new position, and then all of a sudden COVID hit? Like what walk me through that process. What did that feel like?
Yeah, I mean, it's been challenging because we were very much kind of like in the honeymoon phase where like you're trying to get to know people and still forming relationships with teenagers and things like that. And COVID so greatly put a halt to a lot of that. So that was challenging. It was also challenging from a standpoint of, and I mean, we'll talk about some of this. It was kind of a youth ministry philosophy that they were familiar with and very much interested in, but it's really a culture shift, and that just takes a long time. And there's not a lot of that you can do over Zoom or, when things are shut down. And so it really, for me, it's like I kind of felt like I was making some strides that then had to stop and then kind of start again. So that's part of it, but it's been really good. Like I enjoy where we are. I know other youth ministers who got a job in the middle of the pandemic, and it's like, I can't even imagine that. So it's like, at least I had 6 months, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I heard the same thing. My intern from a couple summers ago landed a new gig in the middle of all that, and I was like, I don't even know how you would do that. Zoom, first time meeting everyone.
Yeah, no, it'd be so, I really can't imagine. It would be really tough. So I'm thankful that wasn't my situation, and I'm also glad to kind of be slowly emerging on this side of it and being able to get back together and do the things that we're actually trained to do rather than like trying to reinvent everything during the pandemic, which is what I felt like a lot of us were trying to do.
Yeah. Well, we mentioned your book. Tell us the significance of the title, because you hear it and you think youth and family ministry, but it seems very intentional that it is youth and family ministry.
So that's the first thing I always say is it's not a typo. Like, I just put the wrong thing and they printed them, so we have to make something up now, right? So it's kind of a small change, but I do think it's significant. So youth and family versus youth in family. The traditional thing you hear is youth and family. I don't want to give the impression that youth ministry and family ministry are two separate things connected by an and. Instead, I want to focus on ministering to young people in the context of family. And by that, by family, I mean two different aspects. One is the physical families of students, moms and dads, siblings, grandparents. But secondly, also the faith family, the local congregation. So what that means is we want to help encourage and equip parents to be the primary disciplers of their own children. But also, as much as possible, we want to connect our students to the larger body of the local congregation. We want to establish meaningful relationships between our students and older, mature adults in the church. So that's kind of the idea behind youth in family. And that's actually my official title at Cloverdale. I'm the Youth in Family Minister, which is a little bit unwieldy. Like I'm a youth minister is what I tell people. But when they ask me, I'm like, well, actually, they have this special title for me, and that's what it is, and that's what it means, and it's not a typo. Yeah.
So walk us through a little bit. You mentioned this. It's a very big paradigm shift. But let's start from the beginning. Like, you've been in youth ministry for 15 years. What kind of brought you to this place where you thought maybe this isn't working well, and maybe eventually led to you wanting to write a book about it? Walk us through that. How do you get to that place, and what are some of the significant things that you kind of see as maybe problems or difficulties in youth and family ministry versus youth in family ministry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was actually not trained as a youth minister. I came to Harding. I was a Harding graduate, but I was not a Bible major or youth ministry major. It was just one of these things where kind of in hindsight, you can kind of see providentially how God opens doors and closes other doors. And so I ended up as a youth minister, but that was not my intention. And so I was clueless. I mean, like I'm in this job and it's like I had been in youth ministry. I had mentors who were youth ministers. And so I was just trying to do things. A couple of years in, I started to get very concerned by a trend I was noticing and reading about a lot, which was just a ton of our students who are active in church life, active in youth ministry, make a faith commitment to Christ, walk away from their faith after they graduate from high school. And this is something that I was noticing at my congregation, but it was also other congregations that we would get together and have like combined events with. And then I started reading, and it's like, okay, this is a widespread problem that everyone is experiencing. And so I wanted to address that. Like that, I wasn't just okay with that. You can read different studies and they're all over the place, but like kind of a good estimate is like 40 to 50% of our young people are leaving faith behind, or at least leaving any sort of connection to the church behind after they graduate from high school. That's before COVID. Who knows what it's going to look like on the other side of the pandemic. So I wanted to address this problem. About the same time, I went into grad school at HST, and I didn't really. There wasn't like a class on youth ministry there, but we had all these papers and projects that we did, and so I was able to kind of leverage assignments to do research on stuff that applied to youth ministry. And around the same time, I read a book called Sticky Faith, which a lot of people will be familiar with, and it kind of very much is about helping to disciple, helping parents to disciple young people at home. And then also there's a little bit in there about also trying to build connections with the church. And so I did a bunch of research. It started off as a couple of papers and things like that. And then it became like a ministry plan, and it just kind of grew and grew. And eventually it was like, I should share this with people. And it's not like this is not really original research. It's very derivative based on what other people are doing. But it was still not something that I was seeing a lot of the people I knew do. So that's kind of how it came about, and it was very much in response to the problem of young people, so many of them walking away from faith after high school, and the way in which, unfortunately, some of our traditional youth ministry practices, which are intended to help teenagers, right, might actually be aggravating the problem. And so if there's a way in which we could shift our youth ministry culture to reflect both biblical principles, but also like what research is indicating is effective, then we should do that. And so that's kind of what the book's about, and it's what my efforts have been about for the last several years.
Would you mind sharing a few examples that you've seen of things that we think might be helping, but might actually be pushing them away?
Yeah, so maybe I could just talk a little bit about kind of a stereotypical traditional youth ministry model, which is very centered on the youth minister. We try to ideally find someone who is young, has a great personality, very engaging, who can interact well with students. Even better if he's like, handsome and athletic. And, like he can...
I don't know how I got my job.
Right, same. If he can, play sports with the guys, like strum his guitar for the girls, really interact well with all sorts of people. If he's a gamer, great. He can reach out to that core segment as well. Of course, we want him to be a good Bible teacher. We want him to be a good spiritual role model. Good at planning events, because events are a really big deal. And so kind of like all of these things. And so it's someone who's very skilled, very capable. The whole ministry can revolve around him, and we can basically outsource the task of the spiritual formation of our students to this expert. And so all of this is with the best intentions. We're trying to keep our kids engaged in church life and what's going on. The problems with this, there are a lot of problems with this. One is that person I just described doesn't exist. It's really hard to find that person.
That's a tall order.
Yeah, it is. It is. Secondly, there are a lot of people who are really skilled and will work really hard, and it absolutely is consuming and it burns them out. And so part of the reason why we've got a lot of youth ministers who are really excited out of college, and 2 years later they're like looking to sell insurance because it just kind of burns them up. So that's problematic. It's also problematic from the standpoint that it easily becomes entertainment. Like we're trying to engage students, and so like we want to give them what they want. Well, it's like, I want to eat Twinkies all the time, but it's not good for me, right? And so it's like, just because it's something that we like or it engages us in a certain sense doesn't mean that it's what's best or what's healthy. And so I don't think it's always best in that regard. But also what tends to happen is, and I talk about this a lot in the book, but we have this problem of age segregation where and this is a societal issue, but it's one that's reflected in the church, where it's just very easy to take our young students and stick them together away from everyone else. And we put the expert over them, and he's going to keep them entertained and engaged, and we're just going to trust him to handle it. That's unfortunate for multiple reasons. Age segregation is a big problem. It has developmental problems. I think it's specifically tied to this societal issue that we're witnessing now of prolonged or delayed adolescence. But also, it's not what the Bible teaches. In Scripture, what we see over and over again is that two groups are given the task of passing faith on to the next generation. The physical family, moms and dads and grandparents, and then the faith family, whether in the Old Testament we're talking about the people of Israel, or in the New Testament we're talking about the church. So these are the two groups. And at the point that you bring in someone to be kind of like this surrogate spiritual parent, that's not either of those two groups. And so, I mean, we could talk about traditional youth ministry practices, some of which we do, by the way. So, like, I'm not condemning these things, but like you just think about churches that you've been a part of or that you're familiar with. From a young age, we separate kids into age cohorts, and they'll go to Bible class with those cohorts throughout their time, and they'll be taught by like an adult or an assortment of adults over time. As kids get older, a youth minister, we want to make sure we have a youth minister hired. He can take care of them. That way parents don't need to or have to. He'll kind of make sure that they're taught what they need to be taught. He'll take them on trips and entertain them. We also have things like a special, at some churches, like a special youth building that might be literally not connected to the other building. And so that you'll have class in the youth building separated from everyone else. Maybe on Sunday nights, if there's a small group ministry, maybe there'll be a specific small group ministry just for teens, where they can be around one another and their peers, and they can sing the songs they like and have a meal and have a lesson on their level. That's assuming, though, that that's a weekend that you're in town, because like a huge priority of the youth ministry might be, we're going to travel as often as possible, because like it's hard to keep teens excited about regular church. So let's go to places where it's super amped up and there's all sorts of excitement. And maybe on Wednesday nights, you'll have a special youth group class in the special youth group building, and students will be dropped off, and maybe like they'll never even interact with any adults the whole time other than the youth minister or the youth ministry staff. On Sunday mornings, like when you're kids, maybe you'll have, it's difficult for little kids to pay attention in worship or to get a lot out of it. So you'll have a special children's worship where we'll remove our kids from the context of the whole body, and they'll have a special worship. And that way also parents don't have to be bothered by taking care of their kids during worship. So again, I'm not condemning any of these practices, but what happens when you take all of these practices and you combine them over time, year after year after year? By the time kids are 18 and they graduate from high school, they may have spent many hours at church. They may have spent many hours doing youth group activities, but they've actually had very little meaningful interaction with the church as a whole. And in light of that, it's not a huge surprise that they're leaving church, because they were never really a part of the church to begin with. They were part of a youth group, and now they're leaving the youth group, and where do I go next? Because in no way have I been connected to or been prepared to fit into this larger body. So that's kind of some traditional youth ministry practices that tend to lead towards age segregation And we do this again. It's not like people are like, what can we do to ruin the faith of our kids? It's just the opposite. It's like, what can we do to keep our kids happy? What can we do to keep them engaged? What can we do? I mean, I'm just a parent. I don't know. Like this youth minister, like he's the expert. And so I think these are things that have been done with the best of intentions. But what we're seeing is the fruit of these things, which is not great. And so is there a better way? Is there a more biblical way? Does research indicate a different way? And my answer is yes.
Yeah. And I think anybody that's been in youth ministry or volunteered with a youth ministry for any amount of time would probably tell you, like, to think about the spiritual faith of your children being lopped into this guy's lap, and he really is only seeing them for maybe a handful of hours a week, if that, versus, say, a parent where you're with them every day. I mean, you're eating meals with them every day. You're a part of every aspect of their life. I mean, to suggest that we can even outsource that successfully in any way, I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to approach it that way, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, research over and over indicates that parents are the primary spiritual influences on their kids. More so than a youth minister, more so than peers, more so than any group. Parents are the primary spiritual influencers of their kids. So it's really wrong-headed for us to try to deny that reality. And especially, and it's like, I'm not knocking young guys, but like, to take our most precious resource, our kids, and often to be like, hey, you're 22. Probably you know what to do with these kids at like a really crucial developmental time in their lives when they're going through all sorts of stuff that you yourself haven't fully processed yet because it happened for you 4 years ago. Right. And so it's just like sometimes you pause and you think and you're like, what in the world are we thinking? And that's not a knock on young youth ministers. It's like that. It's a knock on the whole paradigm that thinks that somehow it makes sense to turn this over to anyone, but especially someone at a super young age. But having said that, like I'm 37, I don't want that responsibility either. It's like my responsibility is my kids, and it's like I'm going to help. I want to help other parents disciple their own kids. I want to help facilitate relationships between our students and Christian adults who are mature and can help lead them to maturity. But I don't want to become the surrogate spiritual parent for students. Not because I don't love them, but because I love them and I know that that's a bad idea.
Yeah. It's accepting a responsibility that isn't God-given or isn't what's best for them. You say that now, I think about 24-year-old me. I'm like, man, I was a bonehead. Like, I didn't know what I was doing, I had all this training and now I'm suddenly, in charge of this youth ministry. But, you navigate that as you go through the job, I think. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to address too, though, I can hear every parent right now going, yeah, but my kids don't want to hang out with me. Like part of the adolescent stage is this increasing sense of autonomy, right? And so every parent's going, my kids don't want to be around me. My kids don't, like, what am I supposed to do? Because I might even try being the spiritual mentor, even if I built up the willpower to want to do that. I take up that mantle and I see it as a responsibility of mine. I'm increasingly finding a person living in my house that doesn't want to live with me. and they definitely enjoy hanging out with this guy and going to youth ministry and being with their peers. And so that's a positive thing. So how do you kind of wrestle with that within this paradigm?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is a point of pushback that you get sometimes. So a couple different ways. Like part of it is it's about culture. And so it's one thing if you're coming in a place where there's this traditional youth ministry culture and you're trying to shift it, because anytime you try to change culture, there's going to be resistance and there's going to be problems and it's going to take time. But it's different. And like, for example, at my previous congregation, we worked on this gradually over several years. And there was a difference in the pushback I would get initially versus the pushback I got years later. At the point that it's a part of your culture, it's like, it's just the way we do it here. And so there might be certain aspects where it's like, oh, you don't really like having your parents in this class with you? Tough. Like, it just, I mean, and like, I say that, but it's just kind of like, well, that's just what we do. And it's like, and it's also, we're not doing it without telling them why we're doing it. So it's like, I understand that maybe it's not your favorite to have your parents with you in this class. And I do appreciate your feelings on that. But more than I'm concerned about your feelings about right now, I'm concerned about your faith 20 years from now. And, some students will get that and some don't. But like, generally speaking, people, if they understand where we're coming from, they're more willing to give us a shot. So that's one thing. Another thing I would say is just parents, good parents, do things for their kids all the time that their kids don't want, but that they know is good for them. We have a 4-year-old son who doesn't particularly want to eat most of his vegetables, but he really likes dessert. But that doesn't mean that we just let him never eat vegetables and have as much dessert as he wants to. I mean, to be frank, I don't like to eat vegetables and I want to eat dessert, but it's like, and I'm an adult, so I can do that. But like, I know that's not what's best for me. And on my good days, I do what's best for me, So I think part of it is also just this understanding of like, look, I get that maybe it's not always what you want, but is it what's best for them? And I think for most parents, if they can truly be convinced that this is what's best for them, then they're willing to make an effort. And then another thing I would say is some people hear what I say and they assume that like we don't have a youth group or we don't do any sorts of traditional youth ministry things, but we do. We just want to be thoughtful about which things we do and, are they purposeful? But like, we have Bible class at Cloverdale based on age. Like we don't actually bring 4-year-olds into the auditorium to talk about Song of Solomon, or Leviticus. Like we don't think that's the best way to teach them, and it's like we have a youth group. We have we go on trips and things like that. We do have Bible classes sometimes where our parents are in there with our students, but that's not our common practice all the time. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not like it's a total abandonment of, well, in our youth ministry, it's going to be you and your mom all the time. Like that's not what we do. But what we are trying to do is we're trying to change just kind of the whole perspective of what can we do to help equip parents to disciple their own kids. And so it's not like an all or nothing approach, but it's just kind of tweaking the things that we do to make them more about how can we leverage the influence of parents? How can we enhance relationships between students and adults in our congregation? But it's not like, well, all the things that you used to like, taking them all off the table.
They're gone.
Yeah, right.
As anyone can tell you, that's probably not going to turn out well if you just say, all right, now we're doing it all this way.
Right.
Forget everything you know, right?
Right.
And the youth is still in the youth in family part of it. So there's still this need for a little bit of like, hey, this is a peer only thing. Like that's okay.
We're ministering to youth, so that like there's contextualization there, like in the way that you present messages and the things that you do. I mean, I said that parents are the primary spiritual influences of their kids, and that's true. As kids become teenagers, though, like that goes down and peer influence goes up. So absolutely, we want to create environments where they're developing relationships with peers who will help encourage one another to follow Jesus, right? And so absolutely, there's value in that. So there's a balance there, but at the end of the day, it is kind of like if we can establish that we think this is what's best, then generally parents are willing to make some sacrifices to do what they believe is best for their kids. And one other thing I'll throw out, one of the things I love about our fellowship in Churches of Christ is that, generally speaking, if you can convince someone this is what the Bible teaches, then they will go a long way with you. And so for me personally, I've had a lot of success in being like, well, let's just look at what Scripture says. Like, let's look at who is given the task of passing faith on to the next generation in the Bible. And at the point that we do that, it kind of is like, okay, so how do we do it? And so there's not so much pushback on, well, we don't like this, and more it's like, okay, so I guess this is the thing. This is the divinely given task. So how do we go about doing that?
You had mentioned whenever you started at Cloverdale that you have this very specific title, if somebody cares to know what that title is. Was that something that you kind of presented, or was that some kind of a vision that they had bringing you in? What was the evolution of that?
So I won't go into the whole backstory, but basically it's like they had looked for a youth minister previously, a couple years before. And as part of that, they kind of wanted to reevaluate their entire process or their entire philosophy of youth ministry. Mm-hmm. And at some point, they'd kind of become aware of some of my stuff, and we had some conversations at that point. I didn't become the youth minister, but they were really interested in this sort of thinking. And so they kind of adopted the philosophy and the title like a couple years before. And then the person whose place I took, who's a great guy, actually one of our elders now, he transitioned to another role, which was just kind of like this kind of a dream job for him. And so then they came back to me, and it was very much like, so we're trying to do this thing that you want to do. Would you like to come do it here? Sort of thing. And so I walked in, and the title was already there, but it was based on some previous conversations. So one of the things that's been great, like I haven't dealt with a lot of resistance in my context, because at least for a lot of them, there was buy-in, like this is the sort of thing we would like to do. How do we do it? So I haven't had a lot of pushback in my context, partially because the ground has already been somewhat plowed, and Keith took some of those hits for me, honestly.
Yeah. Keith is such a great dude. I love Keith so
He's
much.
He's awesome, yeah.
So let's say you're a youth minister out there listening, and you're thinking, yeah, I've been feeling this ever since I was hired. I'm on board. I've seen the stats. I know it too. But I'm trying to sort through, how do I get my parents on board with this idea? How do I get my staff and leadership on board with this idea, to kind of understand that we need to shift some things that we're doing to better reflect the actual needs of teenagers.
Right. That's a great question. So I don't want to be this guy. I do lay out a process in this book. But no, seriously. So there is a section in the book that's all about kind of the practical steps, which might not be like a perfect blueprint, but it's what I did, and it was somewhat successful. So like you want to do things like you want to get everyone on board with a vision. So you want to first kind of share the research and the biblical case, which I kind of lay out in this book, but is available in a lot of places. You want to kind of share that with key leaders. So if you're a youth minister, you want to talk to your preaching minister. You want to talk to elders. If you have youth deacons, you want to get them on board. One of the best things that I did, and I wish I would have done this earlier on at Farmington, my previous congregation. I did it pretty early on at Cloverdale. I just preached about it. I got up and I have a sermon called Youth and Family Ministry. It's basically just laying out the vision, and it's kind of like the Cliff Notes version of the book. Just like, hey, this is the problem that we're seeing in youth ministry. Here is what Scripture teaches. Here's what research says, and here are some principles that we want to take and apply to our youth ministry. And so that's been very well received when I've done that in the past. And I say, like, I was at Farmington long enough. I did it twice, like same sermon, because if this is a core statement of what we're about, people need to be reminded of it. And I'll do it again at Cloverdale at some point. So that was helpful. And then it's also kind of about looking at what are the things that we as a church do already. We don't want to scrap everything. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but like, what are the things that we're doing that we could just maybe tweak a little bit and bring them more in line with what we're doing? So for example, if you have like church work days or like days where you have like service projects, instead of like, all right, we're all going to be out here using chainsaws and power tools. And it's like, okay, well, I guess my 6-year-old can't come. And so I've either got to find babysitting, or like one of us will go and a dad will go and mom will stay home with the kids or whatever. And so what we're doing is we're actually splitting up families in order to serve the church. What if instead we just were a little bit creative and came up with some stuff that everyone can be involved in, so we can come as a family and be a part of our church family doing kingdom work, right? And that's just one example, but there's a lot of stuff like that where if we're just creative and thoughtful, it's like, how can we make this a more family-friendly sort of thing, to where we're not sending the message that, hey, if you want to get involved in the work of the church, you're going to have to find a babysitter. But rather, like, the community of faith is for everyone. And so if you want to serve the church, bring your family, because they're a part of our family, and there'll be something meaningful for them here. And that takes some more work. Like it can be harder to do that, but it's also better and more meaningful, because over time, you have kids who are raised to believe, I'm a part of the work of the church now, and I get to be a part of this. Service projects are not just something that I do in the summers in youth ministry, not connected to my parents or other adults.
Well, I understand that you are a very avid reader. I follow your blog, which you want to put a little plug out there for your blog. Very avid writer as well. I
have a blog, LukeDockery.com, and I write about youth ministry and theology and just all sorts of kind of random stuff. I just say it's kind of like a journal where I kind of process my thoughts out loud for people. But yeah, for sure. I like to, that's something I enjoy doing. I do like to read a lot though. What were you saying about that?
Any particular books that stand out to you within the last few months that you've been diving into that has really risen to the surface?
About youth ministry?
No, just in general.
Yeah. Oh, I wasn't prepared for that.
A favorite book that you've read maybe in the last year?
Okay, I got it. So there's a book called Endangered Gospel, subtitle, How Fixing the World is Killing the Church, by John Nugent. And it's a really good, challenging read, one of the more kind of paradigm-shifting books for me. But his basic thesis is that we have a lot of Christians who are very concerned about people in the world. And so we're doing a lot of work to try to fix the problems of the world. But biblically, our task is not to try to make the world a better place, but to be kingdom people, to be agents of new creation. And in a real sense, we're not trying to make the world a better place. We're trying to be the better place that God is going to make the world into. And so our task should be just very much more, it's not that we're not interested in the world around us. It's because we're so interested in the world around us, we want to do things the way that God has told us to do them, which is we want to live as the church in a new kind of way that is light and salt in a dark and decaying world that is attractive to the world around us. It's really good. He goes into a lot of depth and looks at that in a lot of different ways and contexts, but it has obvious implications for the way that those of us who are in church ministry, like we're trying to figure out, like, how can we love our community? How can we impact those around us? And the answer, according to Nugent, is, well, we do it the way that God tells us to do it. It's somewhat arrogant for us to think that we have a better plan than God does. And so he wants to look at the plan in Scripture and, boy, it's really good, really challenging for me. I mean, because there's a lot of stuff that at first I'm like kind of bristling when I'm reading this, but it's heavily biblical. He just kind of walks through the story of Scripture and kind of looks at like competing visions of what the Bible's about and our place in that story, but really offers a compelling vision for what we're supposed to be. So that's been really challenging for me, and it's been awesome as I just try to. It really is kind of paradigm shifting. Like, okay, I have to reevaluate like all the things. Like, am I trying to fix the world, or am I trying to be like a part of God's new creation that He's going to make, all things new? And it's not my job to make that happen. It's my job to live into the reality that Jesus' resurrection brings about. And that's a compelling reality for folks. So I would highly recommend that one. That's really good. And one other book that I would plug, especially for those in youth ministry, but anyone really, Embodied by Preston Sprinkle. It's about trans issues, but he writes, it just came out this year. He writes with a lot of pastoral sensitivity. He's very, very concerned about what Scripture teaches about sexuality and gender and things like this. But really, it's a really good opening read for those of us who find ourselves in a world that we're not quite sure what we're supposed to do here. And so that's a really helpful read for me. And increasingly, that's just something that we all need to be better versed in because it's the reality of our world. So those are a couple of books that I would recommend. They've been really good for me.
Yeah. So I did have one follow-up question to something you were saying earlier. Yeah. So a lot of times when we start to talk about family, for those of you that don't know, the core, reason that youth ministry, even as a movement, came about is because we've got these churches that say, well, we've got all these kids who are here. Some of them are kids that belong to families at the church, and some of them are kids that are just kind of interested in church. Like, why not start to do something unique for them and tend to that? And so we've got this group of kids that they don't have family here, they don't have parents here. So maybe another kind of a follow-up question I'd love for you to address is, what do you do when, you've got maybe 60, 70% of your youth group is their whole family attends here, or at least part of their family attends at the church that you're at, but you've also got friends of those kids. You've got kids who have just latched on in some way and are here, and their family's not involved in faith at all. And so how do you kind of, when you're thinking through what we want to do as a youth ministry to impact every kid, right, how do we handle the fact that some of them are not going to have an actual biological family as a part of that experience, and what needs to change to kind of fit that issue?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So a lot of times when you hear people talk about family ministry, they're really focusing on physical families and equipping parents, and that's great. That's like half of my model. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times that's the whole thing. But that really leaves out people who don't have those mentors at home. So that's why it's really important to leverage the faith family as well. And so in a traditional youth ministry setting, what you're doing is you're basically like, well, latch onto this youth leader, latch onto this youth minister, and hopefully he can step in. And certainly like that's going to be I'm not saying that youth ministers will not be spiritual influences in kids. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying we don't want to take the place of parents. So first off, we have to be somewhat realistic, knowing that parents are the primary spiritual influencers of their kids. Kids that don't have that at home, it's going to be harder for them. And like, I hate that. Like there are kids, and I know there's kids that you've had that you've poured into, and it's like there is literally nothing more that you can do, and it just seems like it doesn't matter. So it's like we just have to acknowledge the reality that it's going to be harder with those kids. But that's all the more reason why we really want to, if they don't have spiritual examples at home, we really want to provide them with as many spiritual examples and influences as we can in the church. And so trying to structure youth ministry to where we're intentionally cultivating relationships between kids, whether they have faithful parents or not, is really important. So like one thing that we do, and this is an example of something that I'm just now starting because of the pandemic. But we started back at the beginning of this semester having cell groups on Wednesday nights. So basically our model is we have like a short lesson where we're all together, and then we split up into groups that are led, like smaller groups that are led by adults from our congregation. And they meet with them every week. They'll hopefully be texting them outside of time. When there's not a pandemic going on, they'll go to their ball games. They'll have special little events just for their cell groups. And what happens over time is these are really meaningful people in their lives. And that's something that's available to anyone, whether it's, whether they have a really good spiritual foundation at home or not. So that's one thing that we're doing that's really important. And part of that also is, as a youth minister, if I've got 40 kids in my youth group or 100 kids in my youth group, or even 20 kids in my youth group, I can't have meaningful, deep relationships with all of them. It's just not possible. Even if they wanted to, it's not possible. But if I've got cell groups of 8 to 10 kids with 3 leaders in each of them, that's more manageable. Where they can have meaningful relationship with them. And also, I think partially there's kind of a triage situation where it's like if I'm a cell group leader and I've got 8 kids, and in a place like Searcy, and I'm looking out at my kids and I'm like, okay, the 2 of you have dads who are elders, and the 2 of you have dads who are Bible professors at Harding. Probably, I can safely assume that you're getting some spiritual training, in your family. It doesn't mean that I don't want a relationship with you, but on the other hand, here's someone who's just a friend who's coming, who I don't know anything about your family background, or if I do, I know that it's perhaps not great. So I'm going to focus extra attention on this kid, knowing that, so I call them in the book, I call faith family and physical family the twin pillars of this model. So like for those kids who we know they've got a rock solid physical family pillar, all the more reason to really pour into the faith family side. And then kind of vice versa. Like for other kids who the physical family is really weak, we really want to help them out in the other way. So yeah, I think that's part of it. It's like if we know that we can't get the parents on board, then what we want to do is give them as many role models and relationships with mature Christians who will help lead them to maturity themselves as we can. And then, of course, always the hope is that maybe through the kids you can also reach the parents. in my experience, that is statistically less likely. I mean, there's a lot of parents who are like, yeah, I'm willing for you to take my kids and, take care of them for a couple hours a week, but I'm fine, but ultimately that would obviously be the goal. And so sometimes, you can establish a relationship with parents because you're establishing a relationship with their kids.
Yeah. Well, I guess we could go ahead and say this little public service announcement for every person listening to this that's just a member of your church, and you're like, how do I even get involved in something like this? Like, I don't even know if my youth minister buys into this or this idea, but I will say this, having been in youth ministry now for almost my 12th year, starting my 12th year in August, there's never been a time where I thought, no, I don't need your help. Never. Like, I've never had that thought process before. Anytime someone's come to me and said, hey, I'd love to volunteer, I'd love to help out. Like, I'm like, yes, here's 15 things that I need help with. Like, right. Every youth minister everywhere, even outside of like a family-centric model, is needing help. But especially, it seems like in this, what you're talking about, it's like, we need you to come in. We need you to say this and to stop thinking about things like, well, I'm not like in my 30s and still kind of young. It's like, no, it doesn't matter what age you are. It doesn't matter what your background is, your experiences are. Like, everybody has a voice and everybody has that potential to reach out and be able to reach into the life of a specific kid. Yeah. And it's just like you were saying earlier, not a youth minister is not going to be able to appeal to every single person there, right? That's just the way it is statistically, right? So we need people to come in and say, I care enough about kids in general to just be somewhere where I can interact with them and volunteer to be a part of this sort of spiritual family that you're talking about. Yeah, no,
that's a really good point. So one thing I would say is we have a lot of misconceptions about what you need in order to be able to work with kids or teenagers. And if you go back to that kind of prototype of the youth minister that I talked about to begin with, we think that's what we have to have, and it's not what we have to have. The one thing that you really need is you need to care about students, and you need to be willing to show up in such a way that they realize that you care. So even if that's, if you are someone who is older and you feel totally out of touch with what the lives of teenagers are today, and you assume that they would want to have nothing to do with you, a great step for you would be to talk to a teenager after church on Sunday and just say, like, if you don't know them, introduce yourself. If you do know them, just ask them a question about their family or how they're doing, or what are your plans this summer? Or what grade are you in what grade are you in now? And probably that first conversation will be stilted and awkward and will not go great. And then do it again and again and just show up. Like, even if it's something as simple as just showing up and talking to them in the foyer of your church building. But again, this goes back to age segregation. In a society that in many ways has kind of abandoned teenagers because we assume that's what they want. They are starving for adults who care about them enough to kind of step into their spaces and get to know them. So that's one thing I would say. Like, so first off, if you want to get involved, if you care about teenagers, that's kind of the necessary ingredient. You don't have to be cool.
You don't need a Facebook account.
You don't need a
Instagram.
Facebook account. You don't need
a Facebook account even if you do. If you are cool and work with teenagers,
right.
They're not on Facebook.
That's right. Yeah, that ship has sailed a long time ago. Yeah.
You don't need TikTok. You don't need Snapchat.
TikTok, yeah. No, totally. You don't have to be super trendy. You just have to care about them. So that's one thing. Another thing I would say is sometimes what I'm afraid of is that people will hear me talk, or they'll read my book, and then they'll like take it and go to their youth minister and be like, "You're doing everything wrong. This guy knows what he's talking about, and you're doing it wrong." And I really don't want my book to be used that way. Overwhelmingly, I believe that youth ministers are people who care about kids and they want to help kids, and they're doing the best that they know how. And either they haven't been trained better, or they actually would like to do more, but they're in a church that expects them to do youth ministry in a traditional way, or they feel like we talked about the traditional model. It's really hard in youth ministers. It burns them out, churns them up, spits them out, but it's possible. For a short period of time, you can do it. You can take all the weight, you can plan all the trips, You can be the guy, you can do the thing, all the stuff, and you can do it. And you don't have to have help or very minimal help. And that's why it destroys you, but you can do it. But what's really hard is if you try to do this model on your own, it totally won't work. It will completely fail. It's literally impossible. And so you have to get help from a lot of people. And so there are some youth ministers who probably would love to do stuff like this, but they feel like they don't have the help. And so, if you're at a church where you think that this sounds really good and it's not what you're doing, it might be good to have like a really honest but gracious conversation with your youth minister. Maybe they just haven't heard this other, maybe they haven't heard the case being made, and perhaps you could make that for them. Maybe they just don't feel empowered to do it. Maybe they tried to do something like this and they got pushback from 3 families that said, well, if you do this, we're going to leave. Yeah. And elders said, well, if they leave, you're gone. So who knows? There's all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So I think we should always assume like our people are just doing the best they can with what they have. So what can we do to come alongside them and help them and give them support to do something that we think maybe is wiser and more biblical and will yield better results in terms of long-term faithfulness for our young people.
Yeah. It seems like most youth ministers kind of go through this and feel it at some point, but if you come to them and it's like, hey, I read this, I'm kind of thinking about this, like, how are you feeling? I'm concerned for you. I'm concerned for your spiritual and physical health, and I want to know, is this on point? Like, is this what you're feeling too? And I want to be of aid to you. And it seems like if you can do that, probably you're going to get some buy-in with that guy. Like that person's going to go, oh, well, they care about me. Right. And they not only care about teenagers and wanting to do what's best for them, but they actually care about me as well. They don't want for me to feel the way that I feel, that probably most youth ministers have felt at some point in their career.
Right. Yeah, just speaking from my own experience, I'm really interested in listening to suggestions from people who, A, have a relationship with me, and B, like are willing to help me implement the suggestion, rather than someone who just comes in and like drops a bomb and then leaves. Like
here's the book, let's see it happen.
Here's the book. I think you're terrible. Do better. I'll check back with you in 6 months. That's probably not going to yield the result that you want. No. It's not going to be very, very helpful or successful. So yeah, I believe strongly in the model. I really think that traditional youth ministry was something that was tried because we didn't know better. And now, at least if we're listening, we should know better and we should be trying to move on from it. It doesn't mean it's easy to change, but like most important things in life aren't easy, right? Like if it was easy, we would have been doing it already. So I would say this model in many ways is harder, but I think it is more biblical. I think that research indicates that it's more successful as well.
Well, certainly there's a lot of biblical research going into this philosophy, but is there kind of a verse, passage, Bible story, Bible book at large that you would say kind of rises to the top that you would say aligns with this philosophy at a whole that you lean on?
Yeah, so I have an appendix in the book where I go through a lot of scriptures, a lot, and then I kind of focus on a few scriptures in the book, and then there's an appendix where there's a lot more. But from a physical family perspective, you might go back to like the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, where parents are given this task, like you've got to pass this on to your kids. When you lie down, when you rise, when you walk along the way, this is just a part of what's supposed to happen. Also passages where, and this is so fascinating to me, like when God gives instruction of the Passover feast, he's like, when you do this, your kids are going to ask you about it. Use the opportunity to tell them about your story and what God has done, which is just to me, that totally makes sense because every Sunday we have this weird part of our worship service where we like get a little drink of juice and a little cracker. And if you're like a visitor or if you're like a little kid, you're like, what is this? And so like those of us who have kids, like I think it's a universal experience. Like when our kids reach a certain age, they're suddenly aware and they're like, why are we doing this? And it's like, and you could be like, shh, be quiet. Or you could take the opportunity to say, we do this because it reminds us that Jesus died for us on the cross and he was raised from the dead, and that changes everything. And in the same way, that's what God says. You use these opportunities in life to talk about that. So that's the physical family. Faith family, there's just all sorts of passages that talk about things like when whether with Moses or Joshua, God will want the law read, and it specifically will say, assemble all the people, including the little ones. Like this is this collective communal thing. It's not just for the adults. It's not just for those of the age of accountability. It's for everyone to be a part of this and to know what's going on. And then certainly we've got instruction in the New Testament about kind of like household codes where we talk about in the body of Christ, the older women are to train the younger. The young can be an example for the older. Paul tells Timothy. So it's very much intergenerational. It's not just one-sided. There's value for us all being together and learning from one another and the strengths of one another as we all hopefully are moving in the same direction as we try to follow Jesus. So I guess you asked if there was one verse, and I didn't give you one. I gave you several.
That was exactly what I was thinking.
But there are several principles there, and it really just kind of goes on and on. It's kind of shocking how many there are. And there's actually more that emphasize the importance of the faith family than the physical family, which is maybe surprising. But at the same time, Jesus does kind of reorient, and he says, I'll tell you who my family is. My family are those who hear the will of God and they do it. And so as we live a part of a kingdom that redefines even what family is, the importance of the faith family is just paramount. Yeah. And that's like maybe the one little bit of critique I would like. Family ministry as a whole has become very in vogue, but a lot of times it focuses a whole lot on the physical families and kind of doesn't focus so much on integration within the church as a whole. And I think they're both absolutely essential, and we see both in Scripture.
Yeah, well, you can find those verses and more in the appendix of Youth and Family Ministry, a handbook. Luke, thanks for joining us today. Where can people find the book if they'd like to pick up a copy?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon. I was going to say or local bookstores, but it's not. It's on Amazon. Amazon's the place to get it. If you know me, you can get it from me as well, but it's available on Amazon.
Yeah, so we'll put the link for that in the show notes, and you guys can check that out. If you have any questions for Luke or questions in general about life and faith and God, anything at all, send us an email to questions@wschurch.net. And Luke, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so
Appreciate
much.
it.
Thank you guys so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, well, and we hope you guys all have a fantastic day.